I'm Stephen Scheuer, welcoming you to another in our series of oral histories in which we are fortunate indeed to be able to interview those persons who have helped shape the style and substance of television and our major media today.
Years ago, when you were an NBC News White House correspondent, you wrote in this book.
I remember it well.
A chapter called More Vast Than Wasteland, an allusion to Newton Minnow's famous line.
That's right.
The influence of television. Referring to the presidential campaign of 1980, you noted that some folks were floating the idea of drafting Walter Cronkite for president. A colleague said, not entirely in jest, why in the world would Cronkite want to be president of the United States and give up all that power? Some 20 years later, is that power in broadcast and cable news still obtained?
20 years later, there's still power that not just the anchors have, but the news organizations have. But it's a more diffuse power, I would say, because the audiences are smaller, quite frankly. We don't have the audiences today in one place, at one network, or even at the three major broadcast networks that we had in the 1960s and 70s and the 1980s. It started to wane, I think, after the 1970s. Television viewing habits changed, and particularly in the 90s with the advent of cable news, it's changed more. People still turn to the network news anchors. They still look to Brokaw and Rather and Jennings, but they also in the last decade looked to Bernard Shaw on CNN.
And Judy Woodruff.
To a degree, and so it's changed. The landscape has changed. It's not the place that it once was. It's still an important place. It's still a place of influence, but it's a much more diffuse kind of influence, and it never has been a deliberate influence. Nobody's ever sat on high at a network and said, we're going to change America, or we're going to elect a president. It doesn't work like that.
Well, let's just talk about policies and what anchors are supposed to do. What is it this undeclared war or declared war between CNN and Fox News? Is that throwing everything into turmoil, or is it the kind of enterprising journalism that we always expected from network correspondents such as yourself?
Well, there are a couple of different things going on. I mean, nobody ever sat me down when I went to work for NBC in 1975 and said, this is what a journalist is and this is what a journalist does. It was just a given that what you do as a reporter is you go and you cover the story. And you are an observer. You're not a participant in the story. You don't give your opinions. It was always a given that the reviews of reporters are not something that the audience is interested in. That was something I learned working in local television for the CBS affiliate in Atlanta. I worked with some pretty remarkable people who had distinguished themselves long before I came along as journalists, both in television and in print. And the mantra was, you are there to report as accurately and as fairly and in as balanced a way as you can. I never knew anything different from that. And when I went to work for NBC, in the 1970s, that was the view. There was no policy that I was aware of. Nobody said, here, read this. And I stayed at NBC for nine and a half years, almost 10 years. It was just a given. You did good journalism, and everybody understood what good journalism was. Now, you can go back and you can fault what we did today, but it was a given. We're in a somewhat different environment now. That was the way it was for some 40 years. Along came cable television. CNN, I guess you'd say the 90s were the era of CNN, and CNN remains a significant force. CNN really revolutionized television news. Ted Turner came along and had this incredibly revolutionary idea that everybody laughed at. It turned out he was right, and he was very smart. People did want more than just waiting till 6 o'clock at night to find out what was going on in the world. And now we're evolving yet again. CNN had such a successful formula, some other people came along and said, well, we want to try that too. And so we have some competition now. I think competition's good. Some of our competitors have a different approach to doing the news than I do, but you know, that's the way it is. The American people pick and choose.
Fox News, we report, you decide. What's your appraisal of Fox News?
You know, my view is that they do what they want to do, and you know, let the consumer judge. I think it seems to me that Fox has decided that it's all right for reporters to, from time to time, inject their own opinion. I think Fox was created with the idea that a lot of journalism tilted left, and it was their responsibility to correct that by moving, they would say, to the center. Others would say they moved to the right. I don't think my personal opinion matters so much, but my problem with the whole premise is that there was an ideological goal in the creation of Fox. At least is my interpretation of it. To me, that's not the reason you know, we're here to do news. It's not, it shouldn't be the basis for the creation of a news organization. But that's what they've chosen to do. And it doesn't change my thinking about journalism. I'm still coming from where I was coming from. It hasn't changed the thinking of, I think, a lot of people I know. And there's just a really healthy argument underway right now. I mean, I know my good friend Britt Hume at Fox, and I disagree very strongly about that. I mean, he's coming at it from a different place. He says the rest of the news has been too left, too tilted. In my opinion, it hasn't been. We've made some mistakes. Yes, a lot of journalists are activists. We came out of the 60s. We wanted to make the world better. But there's a good, healthy debate going on right now, and we'll see who wins. Where I'm coming from is journalism is a profession that is intended to help people understand what's going on in the world, to help them understand what's going on around them, and to let people make their own decisions. Now, in the process, journalists share the platform, share the stage with people who give opinion. I mean, every day on Inside Politics, the program I anchor on CNN, we have people who come on and give opinion. We have debates almost every day on the program. We label them as such. We identify people. We say Babe Buchanan from the right, and we describe, you know, the organization that she's with, and then we'll say Donna Brazile, who was Al Gore's campaign manager. And they will have at it on one issue or another. Sometimes they agree. I'm entirely comfortable doing that. Am I comfortable giving my own opinion? No. I don't think I'm serving our viewers, our consumers well, if I try to pass off Judy Woodruff's opinions as news. Now, is it all right if I interview people who have opinion? Absolutely, because I'm labeling them as such. But for me, as the anchor to do that, the honest broker, if you will, I mean, to me, it flies in the face of everything I've ever done as a journalist, and I'm not going to do it. I'm not comfortable doing it. It's not who I am, and it's not what I was asked to do at CNN. I'm not a commentator. I'm an anchor.
Good answer.
And a reporter, I hope. We are monitoring, of course, statements from around the globe, and we've just, in the last few minutes, been able to get a statement from the Taliban ambassador to Pakistan. The Taliban, of course, being the religious organization that is the party controlling the government in Afghanistan. The name Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif said in reaction to the news of these terror attacks in the United States, and I am quoting, We want to tell the American children that Afghanistan feels your pain, and we hope that the courts find justice. Now, this statement, again, made by a Taliban ambassador to Pakistan, his name, Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif, he made it at a news conference in Islamabad. I am told that there are wire reports quoting a senior official with the radical Islamic Jihad movement. Now, again, CNN has not confirmed this. It is the radical Islamic Jihad movement saying the attacks are a consequence of United States policy in the Middle East. And again, this is a wire report. We have not been able to confirm it, but we are simply at this point passing along to you as much information as we have.
The coverage of September 11th, of 9/11, do you think television news has done a responsible job? You said at a Kennedy School lecture, November 2nd of last year, journalism in general, television in particular, has risen brilliantly to the occasion under very tough circumstances. We have provided information, insights, and perspective that have served the country and the world well. We have all made mistakes, but in a story with such wide-ranging uncertainties, there have been a few. What are the few?
You don't want me to talk about the successes? You want me to talk about the mistakes?
Well, I want to hear about both.
Well, I do think that American journalism did remarkably well in the aftermath of September the 11th. We were hit with a story, like everybody else. Who knew this was coming? So no one was prepared. When you consider the body blow that was to the United States of America, I think journalists did phenomenally well. I think particularly on television, which is the medium that I work in, people dropped everything to cover that story, to give it everything they had. And they covered it accurately for the most part. They covered it with compassion. They covered it with good judgment. I think journalism in general deserves high marks for the way we covered September the 11th and its immediate aftermath. Were there mistakes? Absolutely, there were mistakes. In the first day or so after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, there were reports that, there were trucks filled with explosives sitting on one of the bridges leading out of New York City. There were reports here in Washington that that there was an explosion or a fire at the Capitol. There were all sorts of stories like that in the rush to get information. Later turned out to be wrong. A lot of them, all of them, in my knowledge, came from reliable sources, but they turned out to be wrong. And we corrected them as quickly as we could. I happen to think that the viewing public is much more sophisticated than it's ever been and entirely capable of understanding that just because they hear something 1 minute as a story is developing, that it may turn out a few minutes or hours or even days later not to be right. I think it's critical, though, in the process that we in journalism are more transparent about the work that we do, that we say, we're reporting, here's the information we have at this moment, we're getting more information in all the time, and we'll tell you what we have. And I think we do that. We do a better job of showing people how our reporters operate.
In process.
And process the story gathering process. The more we do that, the more we bring the viewers in and explain to them what we're doing, I think the more credibility we have. We are not Moses sitting up on, a mountain with a tablet saying this is the way the news is. That used to be the way the news came across years and years ago when I first started in the business. When Huntley and Brinkley did their report, it was the stone tablets. Now we know mistakes are sometimes made. But that doesn't mean that we don't try very hard, day in and day out, to get it right. When I'm sitting there reading a story on CNN or telling the audience what I'm hearing or what I'm learning, that I'm trying very hard to get it right and being very conscious of not making a mistake, of not misleading, of keeping things in context. And that's you know, that's not a small order.
And attribution as well.
Attribution, absolutely, because people can be standing on a street corner saying, "Did you hear?" And it's our job not to put that on the air. I mean, even if a good source gives us information, unless we can check it out with other sources, think about the motivations of the people who are giving you the story, unless you can pull all that together and help the viewer understand that this is an evolving thing, then you're not really doing them any service.
You criticize the, quote, network's reliance on television pundits to analyze the recent events which often undermine their own credibility. Referring to these pundits, you said, they parade as journalists but have never paid their dues. The concept of accountability is alien. All that matters are attention and ratings. Can you be more specific for me?
Well, without naming names, I
Yes,
think that
without naming
we have gotten to the point that we are putting people on the air and letting them spout opinion and analysis, and sometimes we don't label them adequately. We don't tell people what their credentials are and where they're coming from and why we're giving them this airtime. I think it's being done in too many places on television. I think it has long ago blurred the line between journalism, helped to blur the line between journalism, reporting, and opinion. It used to be that it was pretty clear, we made a pretty clear distinction between reporting on the one hand and opinion over here. And then at some point along the way, we threw in analysis, and we said we're analyzing stories. You know, newspapers label it as analysis, typically. And we started to do that, but then at some point along the way, then we started mixing, you know, we had reporters who were appearing at other times as commentators, or maybe they were giving analysis, but then that sort of slid over into commentary. You know, there are those who argue, well, what the heck, who cares? The public, you know, they know what's going on. You know, I'm a little more old-fashioned about it. I mean, I think that that lines need to be drawn, and that when we cross those lines, we need to tell the audience what we're doing. That if we're sliding from what we know into what we think we know, and what we think should be the case, which is opinion, then I think we need to tell the audience what we're doing. And sometimes, a lot of the times, if it's somebody who has been in the role of an anchor or a reporter, and they suddenly pop up giving opinion, then I think it blurs all the lines. And I think it's one of the reasons that television, you know, has, you know, that its credibility, you know, has been hurt. I was not there at the beginning of CNN, but I know that one of Ted Turner's goals was to cover the world, was to get news out 24 hours a day and around the world, but also to cover the world, because his view was, you know, we live on a shrinking planet. We're all much more connected than ever before. And if that was true in 1980, when he started CNN, it's certainly true 22 years later, in 2002, when you and I are talking. We are connected. We've seen that even more now than ever before with the terror attacks of September the 11th. We see it with what we watch going on in the Middle East. We see it with events in China, in Japan, and North Korea. People watch the Japanese market, the Japanese economy. When they, you know, catch, what's the saying, when they catch a cold, the rest of the world catches pneumonia or something like that, or vice versa. I don't know what the saying is, but we're all connected.
Uncle Sam sneezes and so forth.
Right. I mean, we're all connected. When if the U.S. economy goes into a recession, the rest of the world is affected. When the U.S. decides to cut back on foreign aid, the lives of people, real people around the world, are affected. When there's ongoing fighting in the Middle East and it threatens to blow up the whole region and affect the whole region, then that affects the U.S., it affects people who live in Iraq and Iran and all over. So we are connected, and when news organizations in the United States decide they're going to cover less of the world, we're all the worse off for it. That's been the decision. The decision was that international news was a turnoff People didn't care about it. All they cared about was what's happening in the U.S., and they didn't even care that much about that. They cared about Hollywood, they cared about celebrities, you know, they cared about, you know, the president only to the extent there was some kind of scandal involved. You know, I really give the American people more credit than that, and I think if you give them the important information and you make it interesting, which it's our obligation to do, they'll watch it, and it's our obligation to do that. You know, I'm not ready to give up on the idea that the American people don't give a damn about what's going on outside our borders.
What was your reaction to the early White House request not to air, or if so, to dramatically abridge any videotapes of Osama bin Laden?
Well, I think, first of all, that was at a very scary time in our country, and we didn't know what was going on with Osama bin Laden. It wasn't clear just how widespread his tentacles were, how many more people he had planted in the United States who were waiting to do something horrible. And so the administration was understandably shaky about that. We were feeling shaky about it. We, and I say we, I'm speaking all of us in the media. I think people, the thinking was, well, we're the last ones to want to do anything to jeopardize lives in this country or anywhere for that matter. So I think at the time people felt, well, you know, maybe they're right. But I think it became clear pretty quickly after that you know, again, the American people can handle the information, put it on, let them make the decision. And if there are secret signals in there, you know, we're as likely to see them as they are. You know, it became a little specious, I think, that argument.
Has to do in a case like this is to see if the authorities, the people who make these decisions, feel it should be released, and I'm told that they do. And the second thing one has to do then is to make sure it's checked with the intelligence community so that by doing so, something is not revealed that could cause someone to lose their life or to reveal some piece of information about intelligence capabilities. The third thing that has to be done is to make sure that in the event it is to be released, that translations are made of the spoken words in the tape by more than one person, so that outside people, not inside people, so that no one would even think of suggesting that it was anything other than as accurate as it could be. And then it would be presented to people, one would think, and they would be allowed to make their own judgment.
My sense is that the government, ever since Vietnam, has wanted to control how much the press covers, and therefore, obviously, how much the public knows. They want to be in a position, and this, I think, is an aftermath of Vietnam. It's also in the aftermath of Watergate and some other instances where administrations felt burned by the press. And they've tried, I think, too hard to keep information from the American people. I know they're worried about operational secrets. They're worried about military secrets getting out to the public and getting into the hands of the enemy. We in the press don't want that any more than they do. We don't want that. I think there's a medium that can be found. There's a way to bridge this gap between the government wanting almost nothing out and the press wanting a lot. Where there is a way, there are smart, responsible people on both sides. We all have the interests, I believe, of the American people at heart. Of course, they're coming at it from a different perspective. They don't want to look bad in any regard, and I don't blame them. But, you know, they are fighting a war that is being paid for by the American people. The American people are funding every one of the soldiers over there. And they're paying for those expensive weapons and warplanes and guns and ammunition, and they have a right to know, within reason, what's going on.
And their sons and daughters.
And what their sons and daughters are up to. And that has not been the case. And if we don't put our foot down in the media about this right now, it's just going to get worse.
Roots, mentors, influences, Duke, majoring in political science. What ignites Judy Woodruff to say broadcasting, journalism? That's
Well, there's no one thing I can put my finger on. I grew up as an Army brat. I was born in Oklahoma. My father was an enlisted man in the Army. Neither one of my parents went to college. My mother in particular wanted me to have a career and not to stay home and have children and raise children, as she had done. She was a wonderful mother, but she wanted me to go to college, get an education, and to have an independence that I think she felt she never had. That clearly was a driving force in my life. Another influence in my life was the fact that my father was in the Army and we moved a lot. I went to 7 different schools between kindergarten and 7th grade. We started in Oklahoma, we moved to Germany when I was 5 years old, we moved back to the U.S., we lived in Missouri and New Jersey at Army bases, back in Oklahoma to Taiwan for a few years, back to North Carolina, and eventually to Georgia, to Fort Gordon there near Augusta. And that's where I went to high school. So I was uprooted a lot, didn't like moving around a lot, but along the way I learned that there was a big world out there, and there was a lot to know about it, and by golly, I wanted to know a whole lot about it. And staying in one place was not going to be the way to do it. And so even though I didn't have somebody whispering over my shoulder, you know, hey, what about journalism? I always had this sense that there was something out there that I didn't know about, and I wanted to find out about.
On Joan Connor's recent estimable PBS documentary, Women in the News, you describe an early job interview at the ABC affiliate while you were still a senior at Duke. Do you know the interview I referred to
well.
and how that ended? It's an interview that was going swimmingly.
I had thought I was going to work in
about it.
Washington, and then I got some discouraging signals from some women who worked on Capitol Hill. My summer before my senior year, I went back to Duke as a senior, majoring in political science, and I thought, what in the world am I going to do? I happened to be taking a course in mass communications and politics. The professor started talking to me about journalism. I thought, all right, I'll apply for a job doing anything I can get a job doing. I wrote the 3 TV stations in Atlanta, went down to Atlanta my senior year spring break, and interviewed with the news directors. The 2 of them said, we don't have any openings. The 3rd one, the ABC affiliate news director, we sat down in the lobby. I remember this as clearly as if it were yesterday, this station on the end of Peachtree Street in Atlanta, overlooking a big parking lot. And we sat there and talked for 20 or 30 minutes about politics and about journalism and about Duke and about political science majors and all that. And I was interviewing to be his secretary. And I got up to leave. I said, thank you. His name was Bill Conover. I said, thank you, Mr. Conover. I appreciate it. He said, you know, he had just said, well, you're hired. And I was thrilled, and I thanked him, and I got up to walk away. And as I'm walking away toward the door, I'll never forget it, this voice behind me says, besides, how could I not hire somebody with legs like yours? And here I was, 21 years old, and I just froze in place, and I thought, what do I say? Do I turn around and say, I don't want this job if that's your view? I said, oh, well, thanks. I couldn't think of anything to say. I turned around, I looked at him, and, you know, gulp, thanks, and walked out the door. Shaken, but thinking, well, I guess this is the way it is. You know, if you're a woman, there's a different standard. I should have been smart enough to realize that before, but nobody had ever been so blatant, I guess, you know, to put it.
You took the job?
I took the job. I went to work right after graduation. 2 weeks later, I went to work as a secretary in the news department at the ABC affiliate in Atlanta.
You have to make coffee.
I made the coffee, I answered the phone, I did a little correspondence for the news director, I cleaned the film. We were using film, not videotape. I kept the film in files. I organized all the files in the newsroom, and I talked to the reporters a lot about what they were doing, and I stayed at the ABC affiliate for a year and a half
Yeah.
as a secretary and did the weekend weather for the last 6 months that I was there. Because I was coerced into believing that this was my one chance to get on the air, and I wasn't so sure, but I ended up doing it, and I wasn't very good at it,
I don't know about
to put it
that.
mildly. But then an opening came up at the CBS station, and then went to talk to the news director, and he hired me.
Hello, I'm Judy Woodruff. I'm 28 years old, and I've been a reporter for WN.
And a week later, I was covering the state legislature, the state capitol. There were business people who were voting on tax legislation. There were people who had interests in cement and road material firms who were voting on highway legislation. So sure, there were lots
state
of
legislatures as usual,
yeah.
or Congress.
But it was a great training ground for me. It was a good place for me to cut my teeth and to learn about reporting. I mean, there's no better place to learn about politics than covering a state legislature.
At NBC in 1975, you're a general assignment reporter.
Based in Atlanta.
Was the atmosphere there any less sexist?
Well, I started out at NBC pretty isolated in a sense. It was Judy Woodruff and Kenley Jones at NBC, based in Atlanta, covering the entire Southeast. We covered 10 states, all the way to Louisiana, south to Florida, over to Arkansas, and the Caribbean. So I even went to the Caribbean once to cover the execution, the hanging of an American who was caught in some drug deal down there. I didn't see the hanging. I was made to stand outside the prison, but I spent a few days there and filed a few reports. I covered blackbird kills in Kentucky. I covered red ant plagues in South Georgia. I covered alligator farms in Louisiana.
This river attracted a nobleman, James Oglethorpe, to bring a ship full of people from England to settle the new colony of Georgia.
For a while, I thought of myself as a wildlife reporter. All that experience covering politics really didn't stand for much. But that was all right, because I stayed in touch with a lot of the people I knew. And when Jimmy Carter, who had been the governor, and I had covered him when he was governor of Georgia, he started running for president, I had some contacts in his campaign. And people at NBC didn't take him so seriously. And then, lo and behold, he won the New Hampshire. He won the Iowa caucuses and came in second in New Hampshire. So
Carter obviously thinks he has provided that leadership and believes he has a record to prove it. The delay was seen by the Reagan team as simply the first necessary concession if the president was to get his tax cut.
well, covering the White House, I wasn't prepared to cover the White House when I got there. There's no question about it. I wanted it so badly. I wanted so badly to get to Washington. And when they offered me the White House, because Carter had been elected and I had covered him, and it was in a way, it was a natural. I badly wanted to do it, but I really wasn't ready. I mean, I hadn't had the experience covering Washington. And so there was a lot of baptism by fire to what I did at the White House. I'm sure I made a lot of mistakes. If you asked me what they were, I probably blocked them all out. But I learned that Washington was a much more competitive place than any place I had ever operated, and it was a fabulous learning experience. Because while I had some contacts with the Carter people, what I had to learn was how to get around in Washington.
Harding Carter and so forth.
People like Harding Carter had been here and worked in the Carter campaign, and of course had been in Mississippi. He was at the State Department as their spokesman. But I had to learn the Hill. I had to learn how people operated on the Hill, that the Hill is a great place for sources. I had to learn how to cultivate sources in the different agencies, how to cultivate, people in the White House who never got their face on television, but who were willing to talk to me on the telephone or, over lunch or breakfast or something. And that was, I was a reporter when I came to the White House, but I think I became a much better reporter after being there for 6 years.
How did Jimmy Carter come to the
Jimmy
White House?
Carter came to the White House thinking that he had defied the Democratic establishment, that he had really done this on his own, and he brought his own team from Georgia, people like Jody Powell and Hamilton Jordan and Frank Moore and some other good old boys, if you will, smart good old boys. But it was a very Georgia team. There were very few outsiders, very few people who knew Washington. And ultimately, that was part of Carter's downfall, because you can't operate in this city, no matter how smart you are, unless you figure out where the levers of power are, who you need to deal with, who you've got to placate, and who you can ignore. And those were the kinds of outreach that they really didn't learn until almost 2.5, 3 years into their presidency. They finally did start bringing other people in, but by then the die had been cast. Ironically, you talk about Carter and the press, here's somebody who had been very open. I mean, he had answered a lot of questions during the campaign. He held regular news conferences as president, but they still didn't figure out how to work the media, how to work the press, and how to parcel Carter out nearly as well as their successor, Ronald Reagan, did. And therefore, Jimmy Carter got some pretty awful press. People took advantage of that access. They wrote about the warts rather than about the beauty spots. And it was a very painful lesson for Jimmy Carter and the people around him. And you know, they didn't understand, I think, until later.
His second term is more successful at the Carter Center.
He's been a remarkably successful president, ex-president. Remarkably. He really has set an example, I think. Ronald Reagan, on the other hand, made his career, you know, as an actor, as a, you know, in the media, as somebody who, you know, loved being on camera. And yet, once he got into the White House, he was very carefully, his appearances were very carefully parceled out, calibrated. They only put him out when they knew they wanted to make an impression. He gave very few interviews, and when you did get an interview with him, it was if you were escorted, you know, before the royal presence of, you know, the king. It was like that. I mean, I remember the first interview I had with him. They brought in Leslie Stahl with CBS and Sam Donaldson with ABC, the three of us, and I was with NBC. We were escorted into the library over in the first floor of the West Wing, of the White House, rather, the residence. And it was as if we were in the presence of royalty. And he, you know, they had given they said, you've only got 15 minutes and you know, you're going to have to, you know, keep your distance and you got to, you know, be careful about this and that and the other. So we all went in a little nervous. And he immediately disarmed us by telling us funny stories about Hollywood and growing up. And, you know, it was that great Reagan style. And so we were immediately disarmed. But that was Ronald Reagan. I left to go to the McNeil-era, what was going to be the McNeil-era news. It had been the McNeil-era Report, half-hour show. They were expanding to an hour. Jim Lehrer was a friend. Les Crystal had been the president of NBC News. He had gone over there to be their executive producer. They wanted a Washington correspondent. And we started having conversations about it. I was intrigued by the idea of doing something more in-depth and meatier on television. And, you know, I talked to a lot of people. I sought out the advice of all the people I respect. Most of them told me that they thought I was crazy. A few people said it's a good idea, but the vast majority said, don't do this. How can you possibly give up a network to go to PBS, to go to this little-known program? But there was something in me that said, you know, I have so much respect for what Robin McNeil and Jim Lehrer are doing, and Les Crystal, who was an old friend, that I just had to try it. I had to do it. And so I made the great leap in 1983, went over there, and I never looked back. I never looked back. It was a joyous 10 years with the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. Wonderful. Two of the greatest journalists I've ever known in my life, Jim and Robin. They set the standard for journalism as far as I'm concerned. I mean, they're right up there in the pantheon of the greats. And I learned more than I'd ever learned before with them about, you know, what is good journalism and what's the responsibility of a journalist, and you know, what's the role of television news. And clearly it was a public television mandate. It wasn't commercial, so the mandate was a little different. But we found that there was a very significant audience out there for what we did.
You move finally from one of the great joys of your life to CNN. So how does that come about, and why does it come about?
Well, I met at dinner at the home of the late Katharine Graham here in Washington in December 1992. It was a month after the presidential election, and George Bush, the father, had been defeated by the former governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton. and the town was in an upheaval. This dinner was being given for the president-elect and his wife, Hillary Rodham Clinton, at Mrs. Graham's house, and I was there at the dinner, had a wonderful time. I was at Mrs. Clinton's table. I was actually with her and with Katharine Graham. And as soon as I got up to, we all got up to say thank you and goodbye, my good friend Tom Johnson was moving in my direction, and he caught my eye, and I said hello. And Tom and I we'd known each other for years. We served together on a board at Stanford, the journalism board, and he pulled me aside, he put his arm around me, and he said, "Would you ever consider leaving the NewsHour?" And I said, "No." Why do you ask? And he said, "Well, I'm looking for an anchor here in Washington, and I think you'd be great." And I said, "Well, I'm really not interested in leaving." And he said, "Well, why don't we talk about it?" He said, why don't I give you a call in the next?" So we started having conversations, and to make a long story short, 4 months later, after a lot of conversations with Tom and talking to Ted Turner and others, I made the very tough decision to give up the program that I loved and the really family at the NewsHour to come to CNN, because Tom really persuaded me that it was an opportunity. He called it a repotting. He said, "We're taking you from a place that where you've had a great run," but he said CNN is international. It's a place where you will have a larger presence, and it's a place where you can do the kind of journalism that you love. You can do breaking news, you can do political reporting. I want to put you in Inside Politics, and you do an international show called Worldview, and it was too enticing.
Good synergy.
It was a great professional opportunity. Still a painful move. It was hard for me to say no. You better believe the day that I told Jim and Robin was a very tough day, but it was a tremendous professional opportunity for me. I'm Judy Woodruff at CNN election headquarters. No one I have talked to can remember candidates debating on the day before the election. Under normal circumstances, it would be considered too risky, but the Minnesota Senate race is as unusual as they come after the death of Paul Wellstone and later Walter Mondale's entry into the race.
Interesting.
Some story.
Absolutely.
That's all for this edition of Inside Politics, but of course you can go online all the time at CNN's allpolitics.com. AOL, keyword CNN.
This programming note at 9 p.m., Attorney General John Ashcroft will be the guest on Larry King Live. I'm Bernard Shaw.
And I'm Judy Woodruff. Moneyline is next.
Then you had terrific synergy with Bernard Shaw. Yes.
Bernie's a fabulous journalist and just a very dear friend who's retired now, much to my regret, much too early, I think, but a wonderful partner and someone with just the highest integrity and that judgment that you want. If you're covering a catastrophe, you want Bernie there with you, because his judgment is unerring. He knows what to do. He's solid. He's going to do the right thing.
And we probably haven't seen the last of Bernard Shaw.
I don't think so.
I've always wanted to have a family, you said, and I've always wanted a career. I do not believe that in the beginning I had an inkling of how complicated that was going to turn out to be. How complicated was that?
Well, it's like anything in life. Anything that's worthwhile is not going to be easy. And I somehow told myself all those years that I wanted that career in journalism, and I was going to have it, by gosh, no matter what. And I also was telling myself at the very same time that I wanted a family. And I believed absolutely if you want something badly enough, you can have it. I've always believed that. And I still believe that that makes an enormous difference. What I didn't realize, or what I wasn't willing to think through, was just how complicated and difficult it can be. I'm not complaining. I would never complain. If I had it all to do over again, I'd do it exactly the same way I did. I would have a career and I would have a family. I might make a few daily decisions here or there differently. I might have taken a few more days off early on to spend time with my children when they were younger. Those are the hardest decisions as a mom or as a father. You know, when are you going to stop working on a story or stop working on getting an interview and go be with your kids and be with them? Because that's what family is. It's being with them and being there for them. And I made the decision long ago I wasn't going to be there when they came home from school, but I did want to be there in the evenings. And so I've pretty much drawn a line around my professional life, and I've told whoever I was working with, whether it was NBC or PBS or now CNN, that I don't want to travel extensively. I'll travel, but I can't be on the road all the time. I can't be a foreign correspondent. I can't live on the road. I can't work weekends, and I don't want to work nights. Now, having said that, when September 11th comes along, I've done all those things, but not permanently. And I'm now at a point where my family understands, you know, that I am going to work some nights and some weekends, but systematically I'm not going to do that. So I know that I've given up some things professionally, but I wouldn't do it any other way. You know, family, when push comes to shove, family is the most important thing. But journalism's pretty close behind. We've been blessed to have 3 wonderful children, one of whom was born with a birth defect, spina bifida, and that's made a difference in our lives, and especially the last 3 or 4 years since he experienced a disabling injury that's left him in a wheelchair. He's now 20 years old. That's changed our lives profoundly. It's caused me to rethink whether I should even be in journalism. But after giving it a lot of thought over many months, I made the decision that it really didn't serve any purpose, any good purpose for me to stop working, that I serve him better and I serve my family better by doing what I'm doing much of the time, most of the time, but by being there for him as much as I can and being there for my family as much as I can. But these are not easy calls, and so many people have to make them. It's not just us.
Tell us about your husband. He's in the biz, right?
Yeah, I've always said that it takes a journalist to know a journalist. You know, it takes another one to know the peculiar highs and lows. He knows it when I come home and I'm dragging because some interview didn't go well, or when I was covering the White House when we'd gotten beaten on a story and I'd be literally dragging into the house. He could understand it and he'd cheer me up, or else he'd stay away from me until I got over my dark mood. Conversely, he understood when I would come home, you know, on cloud 9, because we were first with a story, we'd broken a story or gotten a great interview, gotten a great piece of information. Because he's in the same boat. When I first met Al, he was covering the Congress, and he had been covering politics and was a few years further along in his career than I was, because he'd been in Washington for a number of years longer. But he understands, and I try to buck him up when he's had a tough day, and I, can celebrate with him when he's got a great column. He's now a columnist and executive Washington editor for the Wall Street Journal.
Terrific.
So it takes one to know one. Well, to be a manager in the news business, I think, is about the hardest management job there is, because you're not only part of the news-making decisions, and you're part of deciding what is the news that you're going to put in a newspaper or on television, but you're also deciding how much time to devote, how much space to devote to that story, what stories you're going to leave out. You're also managing people. And journalists can be prickly characters. I mean, they're not always the easiest people to get along with. What is it about, herding cats, and they all have egos. That's what makes them great journalists. They should have ego. They should be smart. They are smart. They all have independent ways. To get to be a great journalist, you've got to be independent in many ways. So to gather these people together, to bring the best out of them, requires a great manager. And many times we've seen managers in journalism come out of having been reporters themselves. Some of them get bumped up and get promoted, and they don't turn out to be such great managers. Others, are magical. They do it very, very well. I think that, we're now in an era where family is something that managers are more conscious of. Even at the White House, George President George W. Bush has said he wants some of his people to go home early during the week. Easier said than done. Same thing in journalism. You know, it's well enough and good to say, yeah, I want you to spend time with your family, but when you've got a breaking story, whether it's in the Middle East or down the street here, you want your reporters and your producers and your editors and your writers and your, you know, your tape editors and your camera operators, your engineers and your sound technicians and all these people who are crucial to getting that story. They've got to be there. So how are you going to both have them there and give them some time off? So it's a constant juggling act. And you want to bring the best out of them. You want to appreciate the best in them. You want to encourage them to report, break stories. Don't step over the line. Keep in mind what the judgment call, you know, what the guidelines are. It's no easy job.
What do you tell the young women at colleges as undergraduates or as interns? We have several with us today if we had a wide shot. If you're single, fight for equity. If you want to have a family, be prepared to make some adjustments, but still fight for equity and never compromise. What do you tell particularly women?
Well, the first thing,
because it's such an old boys network which has prevailed, of course.
Well, what I say to everybody, male and female, is just make sure you want to do this, that just make sure you are passionate about journalism before you go into this, because it will take a lot out of you. But for women in particular, I mean, women today are still coming to me and asking me, how do you manage? How do you manage family and career? There is no one answer, but I say to all of them, don't do it unless you really want to do it. You've got to want it in your heart and in your stomach and in every fiber of your being, because if you don't, you're going to end up unhappy, because there are trade-offs. You can't give 100% of yourself to both. You can't give 100% of yourself to your job and 100% of yourself to your husband and your children. You can't do it. Something's got to give. And you've got to be able to live with that unfinished nature of it all. You've got to feel you were doing the best you could and you accomplished something at work, but you also served, you know, you did the best you could as a mom and a dad. And a lot of people feel they can't do that. I mean, I know a lot of women who've decided they're going to get out of journalism, the law, whatever, because they just couldn't do it. They couldn't give. They couldn't serve their kids, their children, and do what they thought was a decent job at work. I'm sure that I don't do as well as some of my colleagues do who haven't made children a priority. But I live with that. I live with that. And if it's not good enough for my bosses, then, you know, they're going to have to get rid of me. And, you know, they know that. I know that. It's the way it is. But there is no easy answer. And I tell young women, just go into it with your eyes open. Try to marry somebody who's very supportive if you decide to get married, because you've got to have a supportive spouse. You've got to have somebody who's there, who's going to be with you all the way. Life is hard enough as it is, and when you get married, it needs to be somebody who's, you know, going to be like a partner, your best friend, supporting you, because there are going to be some really tough days.
Amen.
And you got to be prepared for those as well as the happy days.
You still have the same passion for this business, for this profession today as you did when you were beginning back in Atlanta?
You know, I have more passion for it. I really do, much more than I ever dreamed. I am so passionate about how important it is that journalists go out every day and do the best job they can and cover the story wherever it is, whether it's in Beirut or Baghdad, or whether it's right here in New York City or Washington or Houston, Texas, that the American people are not well served unless there are journalists who are prepared to go out every day and work really hard to get as much information as they can, not to take yes for an answer, not to take no for an answer, but to keep asking questions and keep probing and keep making phone calls and keep pushing, because that information, that free flow of information, is the lifeblood of this democracy, and we've never seen it the way we see today. We would not be the great country that we are, the democracy that we are, without the free press that we enjoy in the United States of America. People can make fun of the press, they can deride the press, they can criticize the press, and we deserve all of it. But at the end of the day, If we can't get out and cover the news and cover it aggressively, then, you know, our democracy isn't worth anything, in my opinion. And so I'm more excited about journalism. And yes, we've been through some rough patches, and yes, we're under siege today because there's a lot of pressure on the bottom line to make sure that the audiences are high and the viewers are way up there and they don't change the channel. And I'm aware of that, and that's the real world. That's the business that we operate in. But what really matters is that we keep at it, because our work matters. It matters that we report and that we try to get it right and that we try to stay balanced, because the American people are counting on us.
Thank you very much, Judy Woodruff.
You're welcome. I've enjoyed it.